Welcome to our Garden America podcast. I'm Bryan Main, along with John Bagnasco, Tiger Palafox, the usual suspects. And we do want to thank you for listening to our podcast and here of late on Facebook Live as we do our podcast, and of course later on uploaded. And you can go back and actually listen to the entire podcast and a whole bunch of podcasts we've been doing now for several months. Today we're going to be talking about trimming roses. And the beauty of this on Facebook Live is the fact that you can watch John Bagnasco as we describe what we're doing, but also see what he's doing so that it makes more sense. This is the time of the year. You probably, if you live in a warmer state, should have been trimming your roses back. But that said, we're going to turn it over to John. John's going to explain what you should and shouldn't be doing as we learn how to trim roses here on this edition of the Garden America podcast. Well, John, thank you for being here, by the way.
Hopefully Tiger will help me out with this, too.
Sure, of course.
If you're going to pruning roses, not trimming roses.
Pruning, okay.
To me, trimming
would just be like you do, like not this time of the year,
like
but
if you went to the
year.
barber shop and you
Okay.
go, do you want a lock cut off? No, just a light trim.
Right.
That's trimming.
Yeah.
But if you go get your hair pruned, there's a lot that's coming off. So I think the first thing that you need to think about when you're going to prune your roses is what type of roses you have. So we could get really technical and talk about a lot of different pruning for a lot of different varieties that aren't going to apply to most of our listeners.
Is this pruning roses for dummies, basically?
No, this is pruning roses for people who just have a few roses in their garden.
Okay, not 1,000 like you do.
Right. Well, the amount usually, the number of roses you have doesn't make a difference. It's the number of classes or varieties you have that could make a difference. So we'll start with what most people have, hybrid teas and floribundas. Those are modern roses. If you go to Home Depot or your local garden center, that's what you're going to be buying. So this time of year, which is late winter, early spring, you're going to prune roses back, and that's a time of the year where we give roses a heavy pruning, and that's to cut back a lot of last year's wood and keep them in check size-wise. But one thing to remember is that the more pruning that you do on a rose, the fewer flowers you're going to have.
Why is that?
That's really important to know. And why, like Tiger said, why is that?
Well, because you're going to have a smaller plant, and the smaller the plant, the less opportunity there is for flowers. So, and again, that's something to think of for the type of rose that you have. For instance, let's start with hybrid teas. Hybrid teas are normally grown as cut flowers. They have one flower per stem usually, and they have long stems, and those are the roses that people think of to put in vases. Mm-hmm. So because they're going to have that, you don't necessarily want a lot of flowers from hybrid teas. You're not pruning to get the maximum amount of flowers, because then you'd have shorter stems. So there's two things you want to encourage when you make a cut on a rose. One is you want to renew the rose. So you want to encourage what's called a basal break. And a basal break is a new stem that comes out towards the base of the rose. And usually by pruning back heavily, it will cause you've got a big root system and a small top, so it causes the roses to almost break out of their shells, and that's where you get the new basal breaks from. So anyway, let's talk about pruning the rose. If you're following us on Facebook here, you can see the rose in front of me, which is a hybrid tea. And if I were to prune this back, the first thing I'm thinking about on the eventual shape of the rose is to produce a vase-shaped rose, a rose that kind of grows outwards rather than with branches crossing in. So to do that, just remember that wherever there's a leaf or a bud on the stem itself, if you cut right above that leaf or bud, that's the direction the new stem is going to grow in. So on this particular rose, we see because this one's already started to sprout,
it's a new bud right there,
a lot easier to see. We can see a branch is going to be coming out this way. There's a bud that's going to the inside of the rose. If I were to cut right here, that would make that particular new stem go into the center of the rose. We don't want that. We want to keep it open. So I'll cut this right above an outward facing bud. And you had mentioned earlier in our show today whether or not you cut on an angle.
Right.
I've pruned thousands, if not tens of thousands of roses in my life and never once cut on an angle.
Where did that come from, though, John? Even before I got into this
There's
business.
some old varieties of roses, some moss roses that when you make a cut, they exude sap. And people would say if that sap comes out and covers the bud that you've just pruned above, that then the new leaf can't come out because the sap kind of holds it back. So if you cut on an angle and sap comes out, that sap will drain away from the bud.
And that has nothing to do with most roses we're even talking about, right?
No, I would say 98%, 99% of all the roses you'll ever prune, that's not a problem. So if it makes you feel good to cut at an angle, go ahead. It probably won't hurt anything.
I stopped doing it after you explained this to me years ago.
My thought would actually be that if anything, it would probably be more harmful to cut at an angle than not, just because it would expose more wood to disease and insects, right?
Yeah, and the same reason why they tell you to cut at an angle when you put flowers in a vase, because they're supposed to be able to absorb more water, more surface area, would be the exact opposite for a plant. The more exposure the plant has to, a wound, the more likely it could get a disease or insect in there. Same thing, yeah.
So we made our first cut here. Then the next thing that you would do that around the plant, try to find strong stems with outward-facing buds and cut right above them. But then the other thing I do is look for branches that grew last year that are weaker or thinner. And on this particular plant, there's a thin branch that's growing towards the center of the plant. And I would just cut that off altogether. It's just say, I don't need that. It's not growing in the right direction. And I want to encourage maybe some new plant or new stems that are going to be growing in the right direction. So we would do that. Then we look at this next stem that's coming out here, and I have to decide where to cut that. I can cut to outward facing buds all the way up this stem. But if I do that, the plant's left with what's called dog legs. And a dog leg is, if you see right here.
Yeah, it's a golf term, John.
A dog leg is where a stem had come out from a previous stem the previous year or the previous cut. And here we've got 1, 2, 3 dog legs.
So a little history of what you've been doing.
So the rose just keeps budding right below your previous cuts, and it just creates this kind of little offshoot, so to speak, right there.
Yeah, and if you look, you can see at least I did it correctly last year because every one of them is facing to the outside.
Yeah, okay, sure.
So I was consistent. But I would probably want to get rid of most of those, and the best bud that I see on here is right at this point, which is going to the inside of the rose. So I don't want that. So what I'm going to do is probably something I normally wouldn't do, but I'll cut right below that. And now I've got a bud that's coming out here, but I did leave a little bit of a dog leg from the previous year.
I think most people that are watching right now, and for those of you listening, just to describe, John just removed one of the stems that's probably about, what, John, 20 inches long there? Which was a substantial amount of the plant that he just removed.
Yeah,
and some people watching
that would freak people out.
Would freak out. Like, that's a lot of plant that he just lost. And he just told us, oh, you want to leave some more on there because, then you get more flowers and stuff. But understand the rate of roses, the rate that they grow in the spring is so quick that it'll recover real quickly. And he's looking at the overall health and shape of this plant for years to come. This isn't just a one season thing. This is to have it grow for years and years the proper way.
All right, then I've got one branch left, 2 if I cut it up here. But again, I've got a weak stem. I don't necessarily want that. If I leave these, which are outward facing buds, I'm going to end up with dog legs again. And I don't really have a bud pointing in the exact direction that I want. But so I am going to go all the way down here.
Now we've just freaked people out even more if you're watching on Facebook because we're down to almost nothing.
Yeah, so we've got 3 stems, but I don't know if people can see this on Facebook. There's a little tiny bud down here at the base of the plant.
You just tip it toward the camera. They can probably see it.
And so what's going to happen now that we've cut the plant back so hard, it's going to probably encourage that bud to break. So this will give me a perfect vase shape when that comes out. And then another tip is you can usually only do this in the spring, but if you take a wire brush that you use to clean a grill, and you rub that down here towards the base of the plant, you can remove all the bark. And if you do that and expose wood below, that exposes dormant buds to sunlight, and that'll encourage new basal breaks too.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I better take a little more care in the way I trim and cut my roses because I never knew about the theory, John, of a dog leg growing in or away from the center. It makes perfect sense now.
Yeah, now you can do that with all your roses, really, but especially with the hybrid teas. Okay, now floribundas. Floribundas, same theory holds, except that I probably wouldn't take those back as far because you do want more branches on a floribunda because those are multiple blooms per stem, and they're grown mainly for color. They're not for exhibiting. They're not for, I mean, if they're used in vases, it's for color, not for that formal
look of the rose and the petals and the structure of it.
Yeah, so those I wouldn't cut back quite as far, but the same type of thing. You do want to encourage some basal growth. Floribundas have more branches, so try to clean out the center so air and sunlight can get in there. And the reason you want to do that is to prevent diseases. The more water or air that can flow through a plant, the less mildew you're going to have eventually.
Here's a basic question for the layperson. And they say, well, that's nice, John, but how do I tell the difference between a hybrid tea and a floribunda? I'm new to roses. How do I identify them?
Well, when you go to buy it, just look at the tag and it'll tell you. Or if you know the name of the rose, because it had a tag on it and it happens not to say that, if you Google help me find roses.
Like visually, though, can you tell visually? If you
I
don't
can,
have a tag?
but if you're new to roses, obviously you won't be able to.
And we should mention, too, that you don't have to, roses grow in the wild. And some roses are never trimmed, right, John? They just...
Well, we just went and trimmed this hybrid tea, but if I didn't trim it, it would still grow and bloom, and it would actually have more blooms than it would have had I not pruned it.
But you're controlling the way you want it to look.
But I wouldn't get nice long stems for cutting.
And then for people actually that are responding right now, yes, this is a podcast and it will be posted on our Facebook page. And so they'll be able to follow back to it. And if you're listening to the podcast and you want to go home when you ever have a chance and go to our Facebook page, it will be posted there.
Yeah,
for
you can watch
visualize
this again.
it and see what's
And you can
happening.
even pause it.
Yeah.
And go back and play it again. Or if John's doing something that you want to freeze, you can do that as well.
Hey, John, I have another question for people, pruning the roses. The one that you just pruned right now, if people see it, it has zero foliage. Just a couple buds that are going to break on it, zero foliage. And some people think that when you do prune your roses, you should remove any foliage on that because there's sometimes disease or something on that foliage that you want the rose to start fresh next year. What are your thoughts on removing all the foliage of the rose?
That's exactly what we were going to talk about.
Look at
you are a mind reader, Tiger.
The rose that I just put up here is an old garden rose. It's a tea rose, not a hybrid tea. And a lot of the old garden roses, tea roses would be one class, China roses would be another class. When it comes to pruning, it's just the opposite of what we did. It's like almost nothing. So what you would do on this particular rose would be virtually no pruning, except to pull off all the old leaves. And the reason you pull off the old leaves is just for what Tiger was saying. They're going to harbor disease, mildew and black spot and rust for the coming year. So as far as pruning, I would leave almost everything on an old garden rose except the old leaves. That's the only thing I would do, and I would just pull those off. They'll fall off naturally, but if you pull them off,
help it along a little bit.
Yeah. And now the one thing you will do on an old garden rose is you'll look for old blossoms, old buds, broken stems, dead canes, and you
Mhm.
would prune those off. You can see there's a flower that's trying to come out here. You might prune that back. But if you prune back tea roses or chinas heavily, you can kill the rose.
And
It's
Yikes.
And let me ask you this, just because I know it happens sometimes whenever you're doing with this plants, you're simply kind of breaking off some of this foliage as with your hands, and you're not using any pruners or any shears. Sometimes when you do that and you peel back a leaf or a leaf structure,
You expose the cambium
well,
later.
you can peel it and it actually peels back some of the bark, right? Like Bryan just mentioned, you expose it. Is that a concern in this situation, or should you prune it if you do that, or is it okay and you just leave it?
And I know that, Tiger, because I have peeled it back and done the
Yeah.
same thing. What are your thoughts, John?
Yeah, once you're used to pulling off the leaves, you can see how they're attached and you know exactly where to pull them so they snap off.
Okay.
Okay.
If you do happen to break a branch or something, then I would make a smooth cut
Okay.
so that it can heal over easily. All right.
And-
We talked about old garden roses. We talked about floribundas. We
Mhm.
talked about hybrid teas. Miniature roses
Ah.
is the exact same thing that we've been talking about, except on a miniature level. And so you can go crazy because there's so many stems trying to prune them that way.
Right.
Um, just get some head shears and cut them straight across.
But, yeah.
Yeah, if it's a mini flora, which is halfway between a floribunda and a miniature, there are less stems and you can go through and prune those the way you would want. But regular miniature roses, especially micro minis, just go through and give them a haircut, cut off the tops, and they'll be fine. And then what other class? Climbing roses.
Oh, yeah.
Climbing roses are a little bit more difficult because you know how we were talking about the basal break on hybrid teas? You want the same thing to occur on climbing roses. But the way to get the basal breaks there is that every, say, 3 years to 4 years, you should cut out one of the old stems that might be 10 feet tall and let some of the newer ones come off. There's a tendency with climbing roses to you just want to let them grow and grow and grow and never
By not
stop.
cutting that, would that tend to stunt the growth of the
If
rose?
you don't cut it, you're not going to get as many basal breaks.
Okay.
So less
Okay.
foliage on the bottom, less branching on the bottom, and all of the foliage and the flowers and everything will be kind of towards the tips of the plant, towards the edges of it.
Yeah, now to make things a little more complicated, if you have a climbing rose, you need to know what kind of climbing, because if it's a lot of climbing hybrid teas that are just sports of
Sports.
regular roses. For
Yeah.
instance, let's take Double Delight. Double Delight's a hybrid tea, but there's a climbing Double Delight where the regular Double Delight sported into a climbing version. The climbing hybrid teas do fine, except most of them bloom on year-old wood. So if you were to cut those back this time of year, you would be cutting off all the flowers and you would get a lot of new growth, but that new growth wouldn't set flowers till the following year. So on climbing hybrid teas, try to prune those back judiciously or prune them back after they're done flowering. A lot of the new climbers that have been bred, 4th of July is an example, bloom on new wood as well as old wood. So those you can prune any way you want, just to shape or to train, and they'll do fine. Is there any class we forgot?
I don't think so. Not
Floribunda hybrid
class-wise.
tea.
But-
And go back to what you said, Bryan. If you don't do anything, they're still going to grow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it
And-
just depends on what you want them for. If you're an exhibitor, you do more judicious pruning because you want, you're concerned with one particular bud that you're going to bring to a rose show. If you just want them for color in your yard,
Mhm.
the pruning's not quite as important except to clean up the rose.
And if you're going to exhibit it or show it, you suggest about 6 weeks prior as far as the trimming, John?
Well, that's just a general rule of thumb is that after you prune roses, they bloom about 6 weeks later.
Okay.
It depends on the time of year, whether they're actively growing, whether it's summer, whether it's cold, but that's just a rough idea.
Sure.
I wanted to mention a few things, and because we tend to be pretty lenient in how we do things, as we mentioned, if you don't prune it, it'll be fine. John, brought in, his pair of shears, and, he pruned these, but if you do have a rose that does have a disease, you want to be cautious of using those shears throughout your rose garden.
Oh, yeah, going from one rose to the other.
Move it from one to the next.
That's an excellent point.
And then the foliage we're talking about, we say remove the foliage. Well, also, if you have foliage on the ground, this is a great time of year to just do that general cleaning, and, also make sure that you take care of your tools. And so there's a lot of fruit trees that harbor diseases that could be then carried on into a rose, that you're like, oh, well, I was pruning this tree and then I used my pruners on the rose, and that's how that rose got sick.
What's the best way to clean shears or to clippers?
Yeah.
What would you, alcohol? What would you use?
We use Clorox wipes. So between prunes, in between pruning plants, just wipe down the blades and keep them clean. And that's a great way to just keep your shears clean.
Right.
After you're done, it's always 40 just to preserve it and not allow them to rust, and that's a good way to store your tools and keep them clean so you don't have those problems year after year.
That's great.
All right.
Have we covered it?
That's it.
And I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Again, you can always go back and look at it again. You can email us with questions. And, of course, the audio podcast will be uploaded this next week. You can listen to that as well. So, gentlemen, that's going to do it. Thank you for tuning in to this edition of Garden America Podcast. And, again, glad we can bring it to you live on Facebook. We'll do it again next time. We'll come up with another subject. And I do want to remind you, next week we are back again with another show here on Garden America. Bryan Main, John Bagnasco, Tiger Palafox. Have a great day. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time right here on Garden America. Take care, have a great day, and be safe.